Hello and welcome to another randomised gaming video, and once again I am your host Random Gamer Riven. Now we're just sort of wrapping up Dreamcast month at the minute. It's slightly overrun, but as we did a Virtual On video over the weekend, I thought I'd actually cover the really, what I would describe as the holy grail of Dreamcast items for Virtual On players, and this is actually a demo disc. Bizarrely, you might say, a demo disc? Why would a holy grail item be a demo disc? Well, so as you may know from our Virtual On playthrough, that was done on 5.45, which is the Dreamcast revision of the game. Now there's actually 3 revisions of Virtual On Cyber Troopers Oratorio Tangram. That's the second game in the Virtual On series, and apologies, I've slightly pronounced Ontario Tangram slightly wrong. I know a few people and my good mates will slightly have a go at me pronounce it, but basically I roughly translate to Grand Space Opera, as it was kind of developed as a finale game in the series, although of course it wasn't. But it's the last game to use the original core mechanics. Force and some of the later games tweaked the mechanics in a way that really in Mars really weren't that good. The first 2 really are the pinnacles of the series. Now, as I said, Oratorio Tangram, apologies again if my pronunciation's perhaps not as good as it should be, was released. There were 3 primary revisions. There's 522, which is or 5.2 I should say, is the original arcade release. 540 or 545 as it was released on the Dreamcast is the second arcade release, and basically there were just balancing tweaks between the 2. Now the third version, 566, was effectively the 2000 edition, and that was never released on Dreamcast. It was much later ported to the Xbox 360, but 566, for all intents and purposes, was never released on the Sega Dreamcast. And as a result, the 3 additional mechs, basically 566 adds in, as I said, 3 additional mechs and adds in all the Dreamcast stages to the arcade version. However, that never made it to the Dreamcast. Probably it was due to make it as a later sort of release. It was released in 2000, there would have been an exclusivity period for Japanese arcade owners, and of course at the very start of 2001, Sega cancelled development of the Dreamcast, and with that, many titles and ports were thus cancelled. And I suspect a port of 566 to the Sega Dreamcast was likely one of them. However, one of the problems with the arcade version of 566 was that you couldn't actually customise your mechs. Now, for those who don't know, the original release of Virtual On the Dreamcast covered up to 545, as we said, so it didn't allow it, and it did actually include customization features that enabled you to draw your own emblems and colorize your mechs. Now, those customization features were actually removed from the US version. So, as you can imagine, for 566, if you wanted to customize your new mechs, you couldn't do it on the original Virtual On Cyber Trooper Oratorio Tangram. So in 2000, there was a demo disc released on a Dreamcast official magazine in Japan that included a 566 Customizer Disk. Basically, on the demo was a program that allowed you to view the new mechs on the Dreamcast and edit their colours. It also even allowed you to customize taunts, and that was a feature not actually in the original Dreamcast version customization. However, eagle-eyed players who have played the Japanese version, as I have, and I've actually double-checked this, in the original Japanese version, the customization section also featured a test window that enabled you to actually play as the mechs. Now, that test window was actually removed for some reason from the M.S.B.S.Ver.5.66 disk. However, as you'll find out, the test feature was still left on. It's just that the actual option to select it was removed, and of course, as it was still left on, you can actually still access it, but I'll explain more about that in a bit. So as you can imagine, these days it's effectively a bit of a holy grail for Dreamcast players and arcade players, more so for the fact that it is still the only way to get your customized versions of those 3 new mechs onto the arcades, and as the game still has quite a big arcade scene, this demo is actually quite expensive to buy now. And the reason being is the arcade actually carried VMU ports, and basically you'd alter your save, download to VMU, you'd then go into the arcade. The arcade actually had a VMU slot, you'd plug in your VMU and load your customised character. You couldn't actually customise the characters in the arcades themselves, you had to do it on this Dreamcast disc. And as you can imagine, as this is still the only way to do that, this disc is rather expensive. Not to mention the fact it was never released at retail, it only came on a magazine, means most importers are never going to be able to get hold of this, because they effectively have to, you're only relying on the second-hand trade market to find copies of this demo disc. Indeed, from what I've seen of sales of this, you're looking at 5 figures in terms of yen, so at least 10,000 plus in order to buy a copy. It's quite, for a demo disc, it's very, very expensive. It comes with a few other games, but of course, what you really want is this Virtual On disc. Now, where the interesting thing comes is that these days you can, of course, as it's unassigned code and it was publicly distributed on a demo disc, you can effectively download it, and there have been some people who have released it on the internet, which is great because we've been able to get it via a download. Now, unfortunately, I cannot link to any site downloading that has it for downloaders, although it was a public release. Every site I found that carries it also carries illegal wares, and thus we can't link to it. So you're going to have to find the customizer disk on your own, I'm afraid. But as you can see here, this is a picture of the disk itself, and in the corner you can see there it says M.S.B.S.Ver.5.66, and here's a quick flick of the magazine that originally carried it as well. So this is actually quite an interesting piece of Virtual On history, as it's effectively still an actively item that most players are still going to want to seek out. However, where the real caveat is that basically the game had, although officially the game has no form of training mode, clearly the developers had intended to include a training mode on this demo disc. Now, my suspicion is that it was either pulled at the last minute, or having played it, I think it was slightly incomplete. There's no music, and there's, of course, as you can imagine, there's only a selection of stages, which I think was intended, but I suspect probably because it was placed on a demo disc, they may have had space constraints. For whatever reason, they didn't quite finish the training mode. The other thing, some exec at Sega may have just simply said, no, we don't want the training mode, because else it won't encourage people to buy 566 when we release it on the Dreamcast. Unfortunately, they never did. However, there is a way to actually unlock. So basically, if you have the disc by default, you can boot it, but you can't get into this, you can't actually play in the training mode. It's effectively completely locked out. However, a Virtual On fan by the name of Scott Robinson created a little bootloader disc. It's effectively a custom loader that you can download right to a CDR, and basically it's just like a Pacific loader that basically boots up the demo, and if you use it, it actually unlocks this previously locked out training mode, and because of this you can then play as the 566 only Virtuaroids in the game, and it's actually a really nice extra. Now, unfortunately, even though you can play as them, the training thing was clearly designed as a demo because, as I said, there's a limited number of stages and you can only play a mirror match. Now, playing it myself, I'm pretty sure that there's some of them called this a 560, even though it says 566. I think there are a few tweaks and balance changes that aren't final in this version, so I think this was like an early version of 566. But it's actually really nice to be able to play as them, and it is the only way to play as the 3 extra mechs. Admittedly, you're having to use this guy's internal boot disc, but it's a nice enough extra. Now, of course, Matey's boot disc does invalidate the warranty if you still had a Dreamcast in warranty, but as Sega no longer produce it, and of course the Dreamcast was finished production back in 2002, of course no one's got one in warranty. The only other thing he does say in the disc is that you do have to be a bit mindful of the fact that it is slightly experimental. Basically, you have to press Y when the Virtuaroids have loaded in, but you have to make sure you've got control on the menu. If you press Y too quickly after selecting Virtuaroid, it will crash the customizer disk, and I did notice myself when using this custom loader there are ways to crash the customizer disk, so you have to be a bit mindful. Just press Y very carefully. Basically just going to select, if you're using the customizer disk, purely use this boot disk if you're only going to use the battle system. But basically once you've selected your mech, wait for it to load, wait till you've got control in the menus again, then press Y, and then it will bring up this training mode that was previously locked out. And as I said earlier, I think this training mode was actually slightly unfinished as there is no music, which I think is one key element, and there's a few sort of balancing tweaks. But it's a shame that obviously the developers wanted to include it. They may have also had to remove it due to size restrictions, but it would have been really nice had this been the final, because had this demo just included the training mode, I mean, it wouldn't have affected sales of the game that much because you'd only been able to play mirror matches. It would have certainly become a holy grail item even more. But as it stands, it's still it's still basically, if you want to actually tweak your virtualoids in the arcade, you still need the disc. In fact, that's partly why, even though it got released on 5.66, got released in the Xbox 360, transferring your saves from the Xbox 360 version to an arcade version requires, well, an awful lot of hardware and altering programs, because, as I'm sure you're aware, the Xbox 360 save is not compatible with VMU. So you're going to require all sorts of customized programming. Assuming anyone's even done that, as far as I'm aware, I've not actually heard of anyone being able to do a customized virtual on the Xbox 360 version and then convert it to the actual arcade. But without further ado, now we're actually going to take a look at the customized disc itself, and then I'm going to show you a few battles. So I'll just give you a running commentary on the different features of the customized disc as well, so you can actually get a look at what it did and what it allowed you to do. So here we are, this is the customizer disc in action. So as you can see, Sega 1998, 2000, customizer disc, press start, and by default you're treated to two options, Virtualoid Customize and Quick Message Settings. We'll just nip into Quick Message Settings. This is basically a way to set up your taunts so you could taunt various players. It enables you to write quick messages, and then you could save them, of course, to your VMU. It's pretty explanatory, and I'm not really going to set it up because there's not much point, as I can't really demo it in any way. Now, this is the Virtualoid section, and as we're using the alternative boot disk as well, we can do more than just view them. Now, by default, all you can do is alter the colours, give your mech a unique name, and you can also change the design and the colours. So you can swap the version. You can also go into the mech viewer as well and have a quick turn around and play around with your mech. And this is the Emblem Editor, so you can create your own emblem for use in matches and in the arcade version. Now I'm just going to quickly draw my own little emblem before showing you a quick sample of some of the preloaded ones already on this customizer disc. So for actually a nice little 3B extra given away the magazine, it's actually very, very nice. So there's me badly drawing what I would describe as a flower. Initially started off as a Dreamcast swirl, and then here are the load of sample ones. You actually get quite a nice sample selection of pre-done emblems. So we'll just pick one at random, which will be this one, XI, so that's 11. It'll actually show up when you battle, as you can see there. Now, of course, you can select any of the virtualoids, and this includes... So this is Amjim, the secret penalty boss, who will pop up if you play Rebound. And this, of course, are the three extra ones. This is... I always pronounced it Alpha. It's actually Alhambra. This is the Alhambra C. Now, this is where the bootloader comes in. As you can see, in we go, and I am playing as Alhambra C, which of course you cannot normally do on this customized disc, but because we're using this bootloader, it unlocks this previously drawn out or locked out test feature, which I suspect was probably, like I said, I think was going to be included. Now again, you can hear there's no music, but other than that, it's pretty much working perfectly. There are one or two attacks I think weren't working correctly, but other than this, it's actually a great way just to train as these new mechs, and it's a real pity this wasn't finalised in the disc originally, because this would have been the great way to practice as the new mechs prior to actually taking them into the arcade, and I think that's probably what the developers intended, but for some reason had to cut this feature. But as we said, we're using the custom load disc, and this enables us to access this hidden mode. Now I'm going to include links to the custom load disc as there's nothing untoward about that. You do, however, need to have the matching version of the Dreamcast with the custom load disc. The custom load disc does not bypass region lock, so if you want to play the Japanese version of the disc, you need a Japanese Dreamcast, unless you have, like we've downloaded, a version that's got the region locking removed. This version of the customized demo we've actually downloaded has the region lock removed and self-booting, so then it works fine with the custom load disc. But otherwise, if you have the official version, you need a Japanese Dreamcast. So that's Alhambra C. This is Stein-Vok. Again, as you're aware, he's not in the Dreamcast 4.5 release. And again, here we go, we're actually playing as him on the Sega Dreamcast. It was actually really nice. As a Virtual On player, it's nice to actually play as these mechs for me, because when the 360 version came out, it really annoyed me, because I'd always thought the Dreamcast version was final because you heard so little about 5.6, and when I finally realised, hey, there is actually a version after it, really annoyed me, because it basically meant the Dreamcast version was an inferior version of Virtual On. Despite the fact it's arguably the best home conversion. I think probably now people would say the 360 version, although the problem with the 360 version is it didn't incorporate split screen and some of the other features that the Dreamcast version did. In many ways, the Dreamcast version is a more complete package, because you get split screen. Yes, you get online, but I'd much rather play with a mate in a room than having to set up an online and play relying on having good connections and lag. Now, this is the last and unique mech, instantly 1080p 1080 special. You'll notice there's a Sega Saturn on his back, unlike the other mechs that all had a Dreamcast. In the first revision of Virtual On, they all had Sega Saturns. 5.2, they all had Sega Saturns, but for 5.4, 5.66, they've all got Sega Dreamcast on their back, except for this guy in 5.66 who still has a Sega Saturn. I believe this is because he's supposed to be the prototype version of Tamjin. His colour scheme is actually very similar to the prototype training colour scheme that was seen in the original Virtual On. It's slightly different. There wasn't any grey, that was just black and white basically, but I think it's a subtle nod towards that, and he's basically like a prototype version of Tamjin. He's actually one of the hardest mechs to play as, and I was actually getting used to playing as him on the 360 version the other day, so he's actually quite tricky to play as. And beating Oratorio Tangram and Braddock, basically you have to use, you saw that powerful boost shot, you have to use that attack to beat Tangram. But seeing as I lost that match, I'm going to play again and show you how to win. Now, the one issue I did notice with him was that I didn't have on the 360 version, I could not get his sword to come out correctly in close combat, which is what made me think that perhaps this wasn't the final revision of 5.66. Some of his close combat swords weren't working quite correct, because his sword should be coming out in some of those attacks, and it's not. Perhaps I wasn't quite the right range, but I'm pretty sure at certain range dashes he should be getting his sword out. There's that powered shot that I'm using, but it's just actually really nice to play as the additional mechs. Now there's about 6 stages in total, so I'm just going to show you a few of the other mechs and me playing as them to show you how they look in 5.66. Well, yeah, as you can see, we thanks to this guy's custom loader, we're actually able to basically train as these guys. So this is Raiden. Raiden is my favoured character in Virtual On. He is, of course, Thunder God, or Thunder. That's
Get ready.
but I do absolutely love Raiden. He is basically a tank character, and I tend to play as Raiden a bit differently to other players, because I try not to just use the standing lasers. I much prefer to use a more agile Raiden. Of course, that's completely against his actual build design, but it does surprise a lot of players, and even quite a few of them when I did play online, they don't expect me as a Raiden to try rushing them with the lasers and stuff. They all expect you to sit back and try and herd them and then use the sort of super lasers, when actually I'm just going hell for leather, and they're usually taken a bit off guard by that, especially if you're using his boosting 4-way lasers. So I'll just show you off the other stages. I believe this was my play as Angela, yep, and she is probably one of the most broken characters in Virtual On Tangram. She is just so overpowered. She is actually intended slightly as a sub-boss. Her fight is actually fixed in the arcade lineup. You always fight her just before Brados, the midway boss, but she also is like a little midway boss as well. Her fight is actually fixed. And she was actually apparently quite heavily turned down from 5.2, but I still find her to be very overpowered. And so yeah, she is basically just a gliding fiend, and in fact she's one of those characters where basically she can just jump straight after landing and after dashing, and that and you literally jump down. There's not a cooling off period for some of the jumps, and there should actually be more of a cooldown period for when they land. As much as I liked Virtual On, even now looking, as much as I liked it when I was younger, and looking back at it, I can see some of the flaws of some of the characters these days, knowing, having played it so much, and basically having spent so much in games design terms, you begin to pick up the subtle flaws that perhaps you don't do when you're young, or that perhaps you think, oh, that's quite a nice mechanic. I mean, as a whole, as a verse fighting game, this completely breaks the mold, but it still had its flaws. There's still some balancing issues and some unfairness.
Get ready.
This is Tangram. This is the final playthrough I did, but I'll show you these. He's a popular character. Just to show you the various characters in, effectively it's the 5.66 version of Tangram. Of course, if you haven't played Virtual On Tangram, then I highly recommend you pick it up on Xbox 360, as it's available on XBLA and at a very cheap price. It's also, as I said, the 360 version is 5.66, but this is a really nice game. If you fancy a good, solid sort of verse game that's very different to anything else you've seen, this is well worth pick up. Again, the save load feature allows you to save, of course, your custom edits, and then you could then, of course, save them, load them, and then transfer them to the arcade game.